I'm delighted today to be talking to David Salle. My name is Julia Peyton-Jones. I'm Senior Global Director at Gallery Today Estropac, and I'm based in London. David Salle is an artist of great renown who was born in 1952 in Norman, Oklahoma, and he lives and works in New York City and Sagaponack, Long Island. Like many artists of his generation, David largely drew inspiration for his rich visual vocabulary from existing pictures, based on models from art history, advertisements, design, and everyday culture. He creates an assemblage with manifold cultural references, and I'm delighted that we're standing here in a room that includes 3 of his works. This very impressive large painting to my right, and a painting which was commissioned by Vogue Italia, stuck next to it, and then a work on paper, which is in this part of the room. But before we start to talk about your work here specifically, I just wanted to say what an admirer I am of your writing and indeed thinking about art. I read the most extraordinary piece about De Chirico that was incredibly impressive for a number of different reasons. First, the writing itself, but your great understanding about that artist, as you have for so many of your peers. And I just wondered in what way your writing informs your artistic practice, or if I can put it like this, your studio practice.
Yeah, Julia, it's a very good question, which I also asked myself. It's very difficult to put into words, which I guess is why I have been trying to do just that. Difficult to put into words what constitutes a sensibility. What is a sensibility? Does it even exist? How do we recognize it? What are its dimensions? What does it do? What work does a sensibility do? I think, like probably a lot of things that happen in the arts, came about because of a fundamental dissatisfaction with something else. I started writing because I wasn't seeing anything in the art press that lined up with how I thought about pictures or how I talked about pictures with my artist friends. I think if there had been a critical discourse that suited me, I probably would never have started to write. But the kind of divide between the way artists think about art and the way other people think about it, write about it, it became a chasm. The divide became a chasm, and I started to feel so uncomfortable with it that I somehow felt it incumbent upon me to try to respond. I remember reading something that the great Fairfield Porter wrote. Fairfield Porter, as you know, was a painter, primarily a painter, who was also a very active critic who wrote hundreds of reviews over the years. And in some ways, Fairfield Porter was the inspiration for what I've been trying to do. Anyway, Fairfield told the story that he was at a party with Clement Greenberg, who at the time was the top authority on...
A god, if I may say so, a god.
The absolute, undisputed authority on what was good and what wasn't good in contemporary art. This would have been in the late 40s, early 50s, maybe the mid 50s. And Greenberg was spouting off as he did about whatever. And Fairfield Porter, who was much better educated than Clement Greenberg, he'd gone to Harvard, he'd done philosophy with George Santayana, etc. He said to himself, my opinions are as good as his. There's nothing that he's saying which I haven't already thought of. And that's when he decided to start writing on his own. So it was that kind of impulse. When I started to do it seriously, I found that what's required is the same thing that's required to look at any picture at any time, which is empathy. And the quality that writing about someone else's work really requires is the ability to project oneself into the decisions that the painter made for herself or himself. Given the the conditions under which the work was made, all that kind of stuff, the historical conditions or physical conditions, and all those things in a way are self-explanatory and they're all understood. But what's interesting is, how did you get to that decision? How did you arrive at that place? And how does that place rhyme with both what it is that someone can do manually, physically, and in terms of technique and whatnot, and what is going on in them internally, what's their internal life. So how being able to describe how these things align, I just felt that was how I wanted to look at art in general and how I wanted my own work to be viewed. So I sort of had to supply it myself.
No, but it's a very interesting answer. And of course, we learned so much about you from your writing, about you as a person, but about the way you look at art, the way you approach art, and also about your own work by inference. And I was very fascinated to read that the subject matter is maybe a secondary issue, but the composition of the painting, which of course is an age-old, immensely sophisticated tradition, and also accomplishment, if I can put it like that, of light, middle, and dark, how the painting is conceived, how it's composed, the balance of it, the drama, the interventions, the surprises. All this is, in a way, the foundation before the actual subject matter. So it's, I think, a little confusing almost to think about Peter Arno, who so often provides material for your work, the great cartoonist of the New Yorker. That is he of course plays a role, Peter Arno's work plays a role in your work, but actually the sophistication with which you approach your work is something completely different.
The thing about imagistic painting in which there are recognizing images, the audience, the viewer will always go to the subject matter first. It's simply the first level of recognition. It's you're talking about, you've seen a painting to your friend. I saw this painting in the gallery. Oh yeah, what about it? Well, it was a painting of a bunch of people on the beach. It was a painting of. What it's a painting of is the thing which stays in your mind and the thing which gets referred to. And it's in a way it's really the first level of what makes the picture the picture. It's an undeniable part of the picture and maybe the dominant part, but it's not the whole picture. I usually make the analogy between the way people tell jokes. If you ask 10 people to tell a joke, the same joke, you have 10 very different jokes. Some people would be able to make it funny. Some people, no matter, even a joke which is so-called kind of bulletproof, some people would mangle it. Some people would improve on it. Some people would forget the punchline. Some people would invert it. There's no two people would tell a joke the same way, even if they tried. So what's the point? I make this point in my book over and over again. How something is done is the marker of personality. The what is also a marker of personality, but it's in a way that's the giving. The what, the subject matter, all that. That's the joke. What really matters is how you tell it. Some people are funny and some people aren't. So, yeah, Peter Arno. Well, it turns out you're right in your introduction. I spent a large part of my life looking at other things, and some of those other things get into my own work. I've worked at various times as a commercial artist, but fundamentally it grew up being a kind of magazine junkie. I've always been surrounded by print media and all that kind of stuff. but not comic books. I'm someone who grew up in the era of comics, but I was never attracted to comics. But I was looking through books of design from a certain period, and there was one image maker whose work kept catching my eye. I realized it was because of the very sophisticated use of darks and lights. And that only afterwards that I recognized it as Peter Arno, who was a very famous, probably the most famous visual contributor to the New Yorker style. And he was himself a very high style individual in New York in the 1940s and 50s, kind of habitué of very sophisticated, swanky nightclubs and whatnot. But you can, if you're trained in this, I could recognize in Peter Arno, this is not a cartoonist. This is a very sophisticated artist / image maker who's adapting his work to the kind of sophisticated style that the New Yorker spent many, many decades perfecting and projecting to the rest of the world. So I was able to shamelessly appropriate or steal, however you put it, Arno's work, not because they're cartoons or because they're funny, but because of the way he draws them. His style is typically tailored to a black and white print magazine, divides the subject into very distinct areas of lights and darks. That's what made his work paintable. People often ask me, why did you paint that? Why did you include that image in the painting? The answer is always the same. Because it's paintable. There are some things which, for me, are paintable, which is actually a fairly narrow category of things. Then the whole rest of the world, which might be interesting to other people, is simply not paintable to me personally. What makes something paintable? Again, it has to do with formal values. That if you're a painter, you have to answer these questions of how the image is.
Well,
so
I mean, here we are standing in front of this beautiful painting, and I think now it's possible to see clearly the scale of it, and I'm going to just go and stand next door to it so that people can understand the scale. But here is a case. Would you be able to talk a little bit about this painting? Because I think Peter Arno figures in it, or at least some characters that he invented for the New Yorker.
Yeah, Julie, you're absolutely right that the composition is, in a way, my primary concern. And I think I remember having this conversation a long time ago with Roy Lichtenstein, who was also very compositionally obsessed artist. And we had,
sophisticated. I mean, your compositions are incredibly sophisticated.
As were Roy's. I remember Roy saying something like, there are two kinds of painters: those who compose and those who simply make a unitary or one thing, one gesture, one color, one shape, one form. And in fact, I would say the dominant mode of contemporary painting in the last 50 or 60 years is much more in that direction, unitary, in a way, anti-compositional. And it's an attitude which begins with minimalism in the late 50s and early 60s. And it's something which, for all kinds of reasons, gained enormous amount of traction in the visual arts, and it really has held sway over generations of painters and curators and critics. But there's a whole other tradition of art, which is actually a much longer tradition, which goes back to really to the Renaissance, which is you have a whole bunch of stuff, and you're trying to organize it on a two-dimensional field, on a picture plane. How do you do it? What are the principles by which you can organize a bunch of stuff so that the eye finds it engaging, the eye will engage with it. And there are certain dynamic principles that people worked out mathematically in the Renaissance, which they still are true. There's nothing.
Yes. I mean, it is incredibly sophisticated if you look at painting from history. The degree, I mean, I call it architecture. the way that the artist is really the conductor of the orchestra. He's the conductor of the orchestra of what he puts into the work itself, and he's also the conductor of everybody that's looking at it, because the sophistication of an artist who understands how to compose a painting is that they direct your eye around the canvas in ways that you, as a viewer, you're not aware of, but it's incredibly sophisticated. You know, the way, the interconnecting shapes, the way they draw your attention to a certain part of the canvas, what is prominent, the drama of it. I mean, it's incredibly sophisticated. And in fact, it's possible to see it in all these works. I mean, the Vogue one, I think, is a little bit of a different, has a different genesis. It was the reason it came into the world was slightly different. But both this work, also this beautiful work on paper just beside it, it's really, you know, it's very, very impressive. So can you just tell us a little bit about the large painting?
Of course. I mean, you're absolutely right, Julia, that what an artist does in music composition is to create a path for the eye to take. The artist directs your vision, even if you're not aware of it, and especially if you're not aware of it. But you can test the theory. I mean, by making something lighter or darker or brighter or more saturated, less saturated, you can absolutely make it register in the eye sooner than other parts of the painting. I'll give you an analogy from filmmaking. I'm friends with a lot of filmmakers. I remember sitting in a editing console lunch once with Volker Schlondorf, the German director. He was working on an American film, and even the final stages of editing. And there was a scene that called for a doctor to put on rubber exam gloves, and it was a kind of ominous scene. And there's that kind of snap of the latex as you put it on your hand. And seeing the glove in the painting reminded me of the story. Anyway, so Volker said to me, "I'll show you what we can do." He turned up the volume on the snap, the latex snap, ever so slightly, and the scene got scarier. And then he turned it way down so you barely noticed it, and the scene became much more anodyne. And it all happened, you know, it's something you don't even register when you're watching a movie. So painting has the visual equivalent of all the cues that you hear in a movie score. So that in this particular painting, we have one of the most tried and true, long-standing principles of composition, which is the diagonal bisects the rectangle at the point where a square is formed, which is simply called, you know, it's kind of like the fundamental of the golden mean or dynamic symmetry. And the diagonals in the picture set up a kind of energized rhythm, which intersect with other things in the painting. The figures in the painting, the black and white figures, which are borrowed from Peter Arno, are like verticals, and the rest of the painting is aligned along certain diagonals. And the way they intersect are the places that your eye goes to. Now, specifically this painting, what's interesting for me is a kind of painting joke. There's a kind of in-joke of painting and also of cartooning, which is there's a guy holding a newspaper back in the day when people actually read newspapers, that is being peeled back, as it were. If you peel back the newspaper, another scene is revealed underneath the newspaper, which is a silly, jokey kind of graphic art convention, which I thought would be. I wanted to see if I could get away with it. Basically, I thought it was such a kind of hokey kind of pictorial joke that if I could get away with it, I would feel it was pretty good. So this newspaper acts as a kind of visual wipe, the way you would have in the cinema, a wipe, and then another scene starts, but we're only seeing a fragment of the new scene or the old scene, as the case may be. The idea that there's a scene behind the scene is something which I find irresistible, and it also is a metaphor, if I may say, something more grandiose, for what painting is meant to do, which is to peel away layers of surface reality to penetrate some other reality. However, the kind of fundamental paradox about painting is that no matter how many layers you peel away, you're still actually just looking at the surface of the painting. So all of this illusion, as it were, all this intimation of depth and scenes behind other scenes, it's all taking place on a micron thin layer of paint on a flat surface. So that's kind of that reciprocity of illusion and negation of the illusion. That seems to me to be a kind of interesting place for the painting to exist in. The other visual joke here, and I don't mean to say that I think the painting is jokey, but it does use these ideas. The other visual joke is the painting of the TV dinner with a section of peas and a section of turkey and gravy, which if you grew up in a certain time in the States or probably any place in the world, Western world, it would have been a familiar. Is that why don't the peas fall out? Why don't the peas fall down to the bottom of the painting? What keeps the peas from falling? It's kind of hilarious, really, because it's anti-gravitational. I mean, if you turn the TV dinner upside down, the peas will fall out, as for the turkey. And the reason that the answer is they don't, because they're in a painting.
Yeah.
So
but I mean, one of the things that I want to, before we go travel around the room, and I hope we're going to be allowed to have a little bit of a peek into your studio, is that of course here there are so many layers to this painting. So when you look at it, you know, there's the reveal. This painting is full of drama. I mean, the painting is full of composition, but it's also full of drama. And you know, the way the hands direct you through the painting and around. And standing next to your beautiful work is this small, gorgeous study by Alex Katz. And is he a contemporary of yours? Do you talk to him at all about painting?
Alex is quite a bit older than I am, but we're
yes, indeed,
very close friends. We've been friends for many, many years, probably close to 40 years. I talked to him recently on the phone. So I'm in his studio pretty regularly.
Oh, how great.
So yeah, that's a beautiful painting.
It is, and in fact, we've got two paintings by him of that same size. So that there's one on the opposite side of the room as well as this one. And I know we worked together in my former incarnation when I was still at the Serpentine. And, you know, I know he has these small paintings that he does sometimes in preparation for a large painting, sometimes not. And they're very distinct amongst themselves. And I'm a particular admirer of his landscapes, not only in the landscapes, but, you know, it's somehow they're so evocative. They speak to me in such a sort of personal way, poetic way. And of course, poetry is so much part of his practice.
Yeah, well, I agree. This one's very beautiful. I haven't seen this painting before.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad we were able to introduce it to you.
Typically would make 1 or 2 or 10 studies of a subject of a certain we glimpsed in the landscape. So usually would make them on site in plein air and, you know, in real time, and then go back indoors in the studio and refine the image, think about the color, so forth, and then gradually scale it up. So that painting might generate 4 or 5 different versions of different sizes, one of which might be 10 feet tall or 20 feet tall, 20 feet long anyway. So that the point is that for Alex, painting is completely performative. It's all about the performance. The image is so utterly refined and so distilled and so analyzed in terms of its formal components. The color relationships might be very, very finely tuned. That yellow-green might be ever so slightly more yellow or ever so slightly more blue until the color harmonies lock into place exactly right with the value pattern, with the composition. And if you're a painter, all those things are kind of second nature. I mean, you do them without thinking about it so consciously, but you just know that that green is too yellow, it has to be more blue. Or that
But I think
contrast is not quite adjusted. But here's the point, that when Alex comes to paint the painting, it's completely about the performance.
Yes.
All those questions have been answered, and that's that's a rare achievement, and not many people are able to work that way. So in a way, it's a kind of hyper rehearsed spontaneity.
And also, one of the things that I am always fascinated by, Alex, is the seeming economy of means. That, you know, it's which is a complete, it belies everything you've described, like the thinking, the preparation, and also the speed. I think that's another thing, which there's a sense of unbelievable freshness to his work. And I remember him telling me, you know, when I used to work as an artist 9 to 5, the paintings were terrible. Then I started working in a different way, and then they developed, you know, a very different energy and a life of their own.
Yeah.
But I also wanted just to, of course, you will be familiar with the work of George Basilic, and I don't know if you've seen this new body of work.
I've seen it in person. I've only seen it in pictures, obviously, but not in person.
But it's very interesting, because these are they're transfers. So the whole process of making the work is very different. And obviously, the subject matter may be the same. It's Elke. The title is Ice Princess, and it's obviously a recent work. Nevertheless, the process and the marks feel very different. And it's wonderful to have them here in this room as part of this exhibition where your work is hanging. But do you feel a connection to Basilic? Is he not?
Simpatico to George, very simpatico. I've written about his work. I think about it a fair amount. I'm not familiar with this most recent body of work, although I'm aware of it. I'm aware that it's made in a transfer process, which is kind of fascinating. There's always been a reciprocity between painting and printing that some artists exploited. And it's interesting to see Basilic move into that space as well. Excuse me. The thing that distinguishes these pictures from other ones of his is the amount of white space. Mm-hmm. So much of the canvas is being left unpainted, which I think gives them an overall kind of buoyancy and a freshness, which is very nice to see. What we think of as the kind of classic Basilics from the late 70s or early 80s or mid 80s, the paintings have, in my opinion, a wonderful and satisfying, meaty kind of wrestling things to the ground. It wrestles the image to the ground. They're painted, overpainted again. Colors change, gestures change, shapes change. The effortfulness of the painting is part of the drama of looking at it. And but that's a long time ago now. George is in a different place. He's a much older man. And now the I don't want to say cliche, but let's just say the accepted wisdom about late period turns out to be true. That you need to do less. You know more, and knowing more requires or allows you to do less. And Alex is a great example of that, and Basilic's too.
Yes. Now, if I may, you know, I've seen you, it's incredibly intriguing. I've seen you with a background to maybe 50% of your 2 paintings in your studio. And I believe you're working on a new body of work, which is separate to one painting that might come to Paris, I believe. Right. Is it possible just to have a quick zoom?
Yeah, sure. Since I have computers on a dolly, I'm just going to wheel it around the room. You get a kind of quick glimpse of what I've been doing the last year or so. And I'll just say, by way of introduction, it's, for me, an atypical use of the same or similar imagistic structure. I mean, I really try, it sounds a little pretentious or self-aggrandizing, but I really try to reinvent each painting, every time out. They're obviously they're all mine and they're all related, but I try not to carry too much over from one to the other. Each painting is its own thing. This group of works is exactly the opposite. There's one theme, and not just one theme, but one almost say pictorial template where in which a tree bisects the canvas vertically, which is which violates a cardinal rule of design. You never put something in the middle of a painting because it makes the space go dead. So of course, being artists are obligated to break the rule. I in most cases, put the tree at exactly the center of the painting to see what that could do. And what it did is it yielded two separate spaces that could be inhabited by two different images, either in communication or in conflict or both. In addition, the idea of painting a tree, I can't remember how it happened, but one day I realized it called up the possibility of creating a space underneath the painting that would allow us to see, as it were, a cross section of the earth as the roots penetrate the surface of the earth and go down into the ground, which is something I don't believe I've ever seen in a painting before. You might, have a historical reference, but I can't think of a painting where we see the tree above the ground and below the ground simultaneously in the same picture. So that was kind of interesting. Again, these are just ideas. They don't make art. They hopefully lead to something which can result in art. But so here we go. I'm going to shift this screen away from my image, and you'll see a bunch of paintings, and then we'll.
Oh, how great! Thank you so much. It's a very great privilege to do this.
Let's start over here with this one. Is that in the frame? Can you see it?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Just up a bit.
A bit. How's that?
There we go. Lovely. Perfect. And I think this series is called The Tree of Life. Is that right?
Oh, Tree of Life, exactly.
Yes. And obviously you work on a number of paintings together.
I do, because they take a long time.
Yeah.
And sometimes months go by. So in the meantime, I start others, and they kind of all cook together. It's like a big stew.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
And then these are the two paintings that will be coming to Paris, I think. Is that right?
The one on the right, the cigarette box is coming to Paris. I'm not sure about the other one.
Yes. Gorgeous.
This is a large painting.
And it's interesting because the woman on the right, in that one you just passed,
right,
she's also in the painting I'm looking at now in London.
Yeah, she gets around. That figure is very useful. I've used her a lot.
Yes. Yes, she's a woman of real substance.
She is. She's someone you don't really want to tangle with, I think.
Fantastic. But what a beautiful studio, and oh my goodness me. And so these are, am I right, they're cigarette packets?
Yeah, this is making an abstract composition out of an advertising image. I've taken this cigarette package, which doesn't exist, a brand that doesn't exist anymore, called Lucky 10 or something. Yeah, Lucky 10. And I imagine what would happen if you made a ziggurat out of cigarette boxes instead of stone, and saw it in perspective. It's a kind of taking a graphic what if, and using the painting as a way to answer the question what if. So that was the beginning of the painting, with this kind of architectural form of cigarette packs, and then all the other stuff is stuff that in which I was responding to the first image in real time, drawing plant forms from life above it as the kind of arc over it. And for some reason, this woman, this model, who was the model for the Vogue paintings, and when we did that, we did 2 days of painting from life in the studio, one of which is hanging in the gallery. For some reason, she just wanted to be in this painting, kind of perched on top of this farm building, and the character, the Arno character on the right, who's presumably observing all of this is, is a pretty funny character, that's all. And again, this painting has just like the one with the piece, has a glove.
Yes.
Which I don't really have much to say about why that glove keeps reappearing. It's just that, again, it's a wonderful thing to paint. It's wonderful to paint an image of a glove because it's both human and not human, if you know what I mean. And it has a great form, and it's a great occasion to model that form with paint. And you can put it anywhere in a painting, and it does something to the painting in terms of scale, in terms of gravity. Again, this painting usually plays with the convention of gravity. Like, why isn't that tower of boxes, why doesn't it collapse? Why doesn't it topple over? And the answer is, well, because it's in a painting. And I think I like the fact that this figure here on the right, this guy in his pajamas, I like the fact that the painting has an observer in the painting that's also observing the painting. And then we're observing the observer, observing the painting. That kind of double mirror. Anyway, I think it's a painting which has a certain kind of buoyancy and a kind of lift to it, which I kind of like.
Very much so, but I'm very fascinated because I'm also looking at the blue glove here in London as well. So it's a very nice connection to you in the US, to here we are in London. But it's also very interesting in terms of scale because proportionately, the glove is very much bigger than any of the other figures.
Right.
So there's a presence of a human figure, which is of a different scale entirely, which is, the glove is a signifier. Yeah. And also, of course, you brilliantly got out of, or maybe evaded, the challenge of painting the hands or the feet. You know, they are considered to be one of the most difficult things to do. I'm sure that you can paint hands sublimely well, but nevertheless, you know, the hand is represented, but not in detail.
Yeah, no, painting hands is fiendishly difficult, and I avoid it whenever possible. So hence the glove. And the other thing that's funny about a glove, as you say, it implies human presence without having to supply one, because you're always going to think about, well, whose hand goes in that glove, etc.
So let's just go and look and remind ourselves of this lovely painting that we have here in London, because I think everybody will be able to see the play between the two in such an interesting way, which is after all about the artist's language. You know, your language involves subject matter that repeats. I think of the gentleman with his rather rotund tummy at the bottom, whose head is cut off. He could be the protagonist of the painting in your studio, but not necessarily. And it's that wonderful play and repeat. You know, it's like a song, like music. You have various echoes and themes that are come back, they go away again, and this is a very, it's a very wonderful kind of feeling that you can connect to your inner world through the paintings you make and the figures you allow us to see.
Yeah, well, Julia, what I really liked earlier was your reference to orchestra conductor. I think of my work very often in musical terms, that what I'm really doing is arranging and conducting. I'm not the soloist, although I am in fact the soloist, but I'm really the conductor. I'm interested in orchestrating all these different elements for their various, for whatever effects they can produce. And it's knowing what the kind of whole compositional structure of the piece is, just as a conductor must in a concert. Whenever I go to the concert hall, I mean, I've been with Thaddeus many times in Salzburg, and you see these great conductors, you think, how do they keep the whole piece in their head? How do they know where the piece is going? Not just with the notes that are written on the score, but you really have to know where you want this thing to end up and how to get there. So I think about that as a kind of working analogy. And you're right, some of the elements repeat, but they're used.
Well, I would say mirror is a better way to describe it, mirror, rather than repeat. Repeat is a slightly pejorative way of talking about it.
No, I mean, things are, I mean, again, to go back to the joke analogy, you can use the same elements in 100 different ways and make 100 different paintings using exactly the same elements.
Yes. Yes. David, honestly, what an honor to talk to you about your work. Thank you so much for showing us your studio. Thank you for talking so eloquently, not only about your own paintings, but also the other artists or some of the other artists we've got on show at Ely House. And I look forward very much to seeing the Tree of Life series finished, and also to the painting that you're sending to Paris, to seeing it in the flesh. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Julie. It was a great pleasure. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.